Today we're going to talk about pacing, and it's one of those things that can improve your writing and improve the way people perceive your story. Pacing is definitely impacted by genre. There are expectations on the part of the reader. So know your genre. If you have the time and the inclination, and we're in quarantine, so maybe you do, take a set of colored highlighters or pens and highlight in your story where you see examples of what I'm going to pull out in today's lesson. And then I'll give you a specific short story I want you to do this with for next class. So know your genre. A reader of Agatha Christie mysteries would be thrown off if the pacing switched to something out of a Jason Bourne novel. Agatha Christie is very, very slow paced. It's all about every single detail counts. So we talked about Chekhov's gun, and very much Agatha Christie mysteries, everything there is pertinent. Jason Bourne is move, 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 lots of action. And so the readers probably cannot switch back and forth. There's two different. So know your genre. Pacing is the speed or rate at which something happens, whereas action is the act of doing something. So sometimes action impacts pacing, but it is the speed or rate at which something happens that is most impactful for pacing. So action, just to give you a setup, for a story, action is goal-oriented. So a hero doesn't help orphans because they're just genuinely good people, although they might be. They typically have a goal, which could be keeping a job. We had a character several semesters ago where she was an older person and she was trying to prove she was relevant. And so working with the young orphans was her way of proving herself. It could be a way to stay busy. There's usually a goal behind what our characters do in a story. Action slows if the narrator spends too much time in their head. So while it's important we understand the character's motivation, don't spend a lot of time in the head unless you're trying to slow down the pacing, which we'll get to here in a few minutes. Action slows when dialogue takes over. So when you have a character start to monologue, you're going to slow down the action. And I would say monologuing isn't 100% awful, but it has become one of those things that people will point out in your work. If it's not interactive, there's no sense of setting, there's no sense of purpose. It's just for us to get out whatever the character's goals are. That would be monologuing. Action slows down when sentences are too long or complicated. So when you're describing something and you write in long, complicated sentences, that might be a good thing to slow down the pace and the action. But if you're trying to write a very active scene, those long, complicated sentences are going to slow your reader. So let's look at the other side of this. Action speeds when sentences of words are short or medium in length. So when you're wanting to increase the action, shorten the words and the sentences. Action speeds up when description is minimal. And I think some of you have noticed this for sure, that you just intuitively shorten your sentences. That's sort of that moment in a movie where you're sitting forward in your seat. That's what these shorter sentences, shorter descriptions, shorter words are going to do for your reader. Action speeds up when dialogue and internal dialogue are minimal. In other words, the less dialogue you have, the faster the action scene goes. Action speeds up when you use specifically well-chosen props that evoke an emotional response. In other words, it's not that they're seeing everything. Everything they see is pertinent to the scene. Now let's look at pacing. So pacing is a speed or rate at which something happens. So if you've watched any of the John Wick movies, I think they're brilliant. They are definitely brutal, but the speed at which John Wick exacts revenge is fast. He wastes no time. They do what they do in the beginning that sort of is the impetus for the whole movie or whole series, and it's very fast. The pace at which the Count of Monte Cristo exacts revenge is slow, and I mean decades, but it is consistent. Pacing slows with too much insignificant description. So in Chekhov's gun, if you're going to have a gun in Act 1, you need to shoot it in Act 2. And so if you have a mystery-oriented or a scene in which you're wanting the reader to catch on to some details, make sure it's serving multiple purposes and that you don't have insignificant details in there. I have a basement scene in one of my books, and basement scenes are one of those things you don't want it to be trite or cliched, but there were several pertinent reasons to have it in there. And so the main character is looking to hide a gun from police that they perceive may be on their way to execute a warrant. And so the character goes into the basement, and what you see are washer and dryer, tools, paint cans, and a bare light bulb. So the washer and dryer become the place to hide the gun in the dryer vent, but it's also the washer, or not the washer, the dryer is the place where the minor victim hides later inside the dryer to keep away from the bad people. So it serves the purpose of both hiding the gun and hiding the minor victim later. The tools show up later in that particular book as weapons in one of the characters' hands, since the gun is obviously hidden. The paint cans tie into the character whose house it is as an artist, but it also is considered as a place to hide weapons and or evidence, so it serves multiple purposes. And then there's a bare light bulb, which is part of the mood and the setting. Everything in there that's described serves a purpose, so it's not insignificant description. It is all relevant. Pacing will slow when scenes appear aimless. Remember goal, motivation, and conflict we talked about with the characters. If your heroine is wandering aimlessly in the basement without a purpose, the scene should be cut. So the reason the scene stays is because they're there to hide evidence. It plants, it's foreshadowing future weapons, future hiding places. All of that is in this very short scene about hiding evidence. Pacing slows when sentences are long and complex. There may be times when you want to do that. One of the places that, let's go back here, because one of the places where we want pacing to slow down is when you have action, action, action. The reader needs a place to breathe. So for instance, in John Wick, it's incredibly brutal and fast paces, but there are scenes that slow things down because the viewer needs that moment to slow down, catch their breath before we go into the next action sequences. So there may be places where you do want to use long, complex sentences, and we'll look at where that is later in this lecture. Pacing, it speeds up when there are cliffhangers, so the reader keeps turning the pages to find out what happens next. And this is really a change in the way publishing has gone. So if you read an older book, this may or may not be true, but chapters and scenes used to have a beginning, a middle, and an end in the same way that a book does or Act 1 does. But more and more, publishers are changing the pace by ending with a hook or cliffhanger that forces the reader to start the next chapter. It really is why I don't get much sleep, is because the way it's designed so that you don't put the book down ever. And I have had a publisher that specifically said this, like, you need to end your chapters on. So I was trying to do beginning, middle, and end, and they wanted me to sort of cut the chapter in the middle or the end of the middle to leave it as a cliffhanger and then have the end in the next chapter so that you force the reader to keep going so that they can't take that break and go to sleep. Which is why, as a reader, I now will sometimes stop in the middle of a chapter because I know this is what they're going to do to me and I'll never get to sleep. Pacing speeds when dialogue is pared down and sparse. So make sure your dialogue is filled with tension and the characters speak when we're tense. So I don't know about you, but when I'm tense, I tend to be more monosyllabic. I don't want to talk. I'm very clipped. I'm short phrases, short words. That's all part of tension. So you want fewer descriptions and attributions, which is he said, she said, and make it more like a tennis match where it's like an argument back and forth between people. So when you pare down dialogue in this way, you're actually increasing your pacing. Pacing speeds up when there's suspense. So prolong the climactic event, draw it out, because the reader is blowing through the pages to find out how this turns out. Any existing suspense movie does this, where the murder or attempted murder slows down. So Hitchcock did this. Who's kind of a miracle at it. We're literally on the edge of our seats, and you want to replicate that if you're writing suspense or suspenseful scenes draw that out. Don't get to a conclusion right away. Don't. We want to get to the end because we're so excited by this scene, but the more you draw it out, the more you slow things down, the suspense is going to increase the pace at which your reader reads. Pacing speeds when you cut to the next scene. So, and this is two different ways that this is used. So you can leave out the stuff a reader can figure out for themselves. For instance, if all that's going to happen is they drive to the next scene, just cut the scene. We'll figure out that they got there however they got there. Another way is to cut to the next scene with different characters, and you see this a lot in fantasy. You'll see it in mystery, where we put one character in a precarious situation, and then we cut to a different set of characters. You see that in fantasy all the time. You also see it in murder mysteries where you've got the intended victim who doesn't know what's about to happen and they're living their life, and then you cut to the scene where the bad guy is planning this evil thing, and it builds the pace because we're going back and forth between these two characters. And oftentimes you'll see much shorter scenes and jumping back and forth between characters or groups of characters to increase the pace at which the reader experiences the story. Pacing speeds when you stack events one on top of the next. So the movie Speed, if you haven't watched it, it's actually a really good thing to read for pacing. And it also it comes full circle, which I think most people appreciate. There's a bomb on the bus is the way it starts. And once we get used to that, then the next thing happens. So I think there's a bomb on the bus. They can't slow down. Somebody tries to leave and gets blown up. Like there's every time we get comfortable and we're no longer tense, another bad thing happens. In the closing scenes, they get off the bus and try to trap the bad guy. The bad guy kidnaps a girl because this is a movie, right? The girl's on a subway car, which leads to a fight on the roof of the subway car between the bad guy and the cop. And this works particularly well when you have this event after event after event. Works really well in Act 3 because you're moving the reader quickly to your climax and your resolution. And so this fast, as you're stacking events one on top of the other, you're adding more complications. You're also speeding up the pacing of the novel or short story if you write short stories. Pacing increases with short scenes and chapters. So this one I use frequently, and I will say some of that's because of demands in my publisher, just because they like leaving things on a hook. When I get to the final climactic event, I jump in with short scenes from one character to the next. So I talked about that earlier. We're going back and forth. So you've got short scene with one group, short scene with another group, short scene with another group. And this jumping between these short scenes and chapters, the reader stays so engaged and they want to know what happens, and they look at it and they're like, oh, this is only a 3-page chapter. And so it keeps them reading and engaged in the story. Pacing increases with strong active voice. Cut as much passive voice as you can. We've talked some this semester about that. Long, involved paragraphs should be broken up to speed the pacing. So if you've ever been reading a book and you've got a paragraph that's 1.5 pages long, when you want your pacing to increase, you're going to cut that back. You're going to make shorter paragraphs, shorter, more active sentences using active verbs instead of passive verbs. So instead of a passive sentence would be the gun was loaded by Paul as the wall protected his back. So Paul is not active in that sentence or in that scene. But if you say Paul backed into the corner, he popped a fresh clip into the gun, no way to blindside him, nowhere to run, let the zombies come. So you're making him active, and you'll notice that those sentences are all very short and clipped, and that should increase your pacing. However, pacing speeds up when all description is relevant. So again, think Chekhov's gun. When you have a very tense scene and all of the description is relevant, everything is a potential weapon or potential foreshadowing. The reader is reading faster because the description is relevant. We are no longer creating a world, we are creating tension. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how pacing is impacted by structure. Pre-plotting or pre-writing, pre-plotting or rewriting follow a set of plot guidelines such as a 3-act structure. One of my favorite places to learn that is Christopher Vogler's Hero's Journey. but you can choose. There's Save the Cat. There's many different forms of plotting that use the 3-act structure. If you're a scriptwriter, 3-act structure should be intuitive to you. But this helps provide a consistent reading experience. The pace stays consistent because the writer has a place to go and isn't wandering aimlessly like Harry Potter in the first half of book 7. So as a technique, like, I don't know if you read the last book and thought that it was really, really long. Part of it is a technique because Harry is essentially lost and he really doesn't know what to do, and he really is only 17 years old. But if you don't have a book series that is as popular as J.K. Rowling's, maybe don't have your characters wandering around aimlessly for that long. You want consistent pacing so that your reader knows what to expect, and you can either do that by plotting in advance, or you can do that when you're rewriting. A novel or story with a good, or script for that matter, with a good even pace, not necessarily fast, but consistent pace, has the following: an even flow between action or dialogue and description scenes, a balance of scenes, so they're not all the same. You don't want to give, have everything be so even that there is no tension. You want the tension, and so you need some action scenes, some dialogue scenes. You need a balance of those things. A poorly paced novel will get the reader bored, and the bored reader will quit. I think I had somebody tell me once they give a book 50 pages, and if it's not interesting, they're done. And I honestly will quit sooner than that if it's a new author that I don't know. If the reader gets overwhelmed, and this happens when we just keep throwing more and more at the character, and we give the reader no place to breathe and to figure out what's going on, the reader will get overwhelmed and quit. So we have to find that balance, and some of that is according to genre. Avoid putting the reader in a position where there's a long lull in the action because it's boring, or too many action-packed scenes back to back, which is exhausting. If you've ever watched Punisher, the TV that's on Netflix, I think, he is sometimes exhausting to watch because there's so much brutality and there's no place to breathe that we kind of have to turn off and wait to come back to the next episode because we need that moment to reflect. To a certain extent, this is controlled by your genre. No matter the genre, the pacing should remain consistent. So have a balance of action and dialogue and description, internal dialogue. There should be sort of this natural pattern that you fall into that's stylistic in a way, but that doesn't focus too heavily on one or the other. I will say, when you're writing and the writing is hot, don't worry about this stuff. This is stuff that you put in or layer in the revision. So if the writing's really, really fast and you're writing really, really tense scenes and they're all strung together, you can go back and input a layer that lets the reader catch their breath through a dialogue scene or a different character scene. But while the writing's hot, keep going, and then on revisions, come back and do that. So Act 2 is a great place to control some of this. Act 2 is a series of plot points that are rising action, right? So you provide a cycle of action that's easy to replicate. And so this one I had found and makes a lot of sense to me. Sometimes they call it the try-fail cycle. So this is where the character is learning the skills that they need to overcome the big obstacle. And so it could be playing golf if it's Tin Cup. It could be intergalactic war. You see it in Star Wars. There's a character that in Luke, where at the very beginning he is maybe not that great at some of these skills because he grew up on a farm, and so he's learning them through this try-fail cycle. So this is an example of a cycle of scenes that are going to help you build an even pacing. So you have the aftermath, where the hero or heroine deals with the aftermath, such as of a previous plot point. So it could be a turning point. So when we're looking at Star Wars, the aftermath of his aunt and uncle dying. The acceptance is where the hero or heroine accepts the new reality. And so this could be the moment when Luke decides that he's going to go on this journey with Obi-Wan. The setup to the next big plot point then happens. We have an obstacle. So they've got to get off the planet. They're wanted. They meet Han, and so we're setting up this new big plot point, which is going to be the next obstacle. The suspense where the reader knows something's going to happen. So as they're in this bar, which is one of those iconic scenes in cinema, it's really setting up the next big plot point, and we're wondering what's going to happen because we know something is not good. Something in this new environment in this bar is going to negatively impact our characters. And then it sets up the next plot point, which is your obstacle. So they shoot somebody, they're on the run to get to the Millennium Falcon. So this cycle of, you have the aftermath where they deal with it, acceptance of the new reality, they set up the next, which sets up the next big plot point. So they actually do get on, if we're looking to continue the cycle, they do get on the Millennium Falcon. And then we have suspenseful moments where the reader knows something is about to happen. And then we set up the next big obstacle. And so that's that try-fail cycle within Act 2, prevents Act 2 from getting bogged down, because Act 2 can sometimes, whether you're writing a book or a story or a script, Act 2 is really easy to lose pacing. And so this is one way to make sure the pacing stays consistent. So to make it consistent, figure out what your intuitive cycle is. If it takes 5,000 or 10,000 or 20,000 words for you to get from plot point 1 to plot point 2, then it should take a similar count to get to the next plot point. So your reader is seeing this cycle building and building and building, and that helps you build tension when you have that kind of, even if the reader doesn't consciously think of it, it's going to help them because they can feel that tension building. Years ago when I first started writing, I took one of my favorite authors and I typed out the first 3 chapters of her books. And what this did for me is it built my understanding of scenes, sequences, chapters, tension, cliffhangers, all of that. By typing it out, it sort of became part of my subconscious as I was developing my own stories. What was my pacing like? What was my dialogue to description ratio? And so if you have a story that you can look at by typing it out to get a sense for how the original writing goes, for me, sometimes typing it works. You can also use highlighters. How to improve your understanding of pacing. Read widely in all genres because you'll see a difference between a thriller and a murder mystery. Even though they're both solving a mystery, their pacing is very different. You should also read in literary genres. You should read in speculative fiction, sci-fi, fantasy. Read contemporary commercial fiction as well as classical stories because you get a sense for how story has changed over time and how it has stayed the same. Read books with critical acclaim for pacing or action so you get a sense for it. There's a very big difference between Jason Bourne, who is a thriller and very fast paced, and then something by James Patterson, who he is solving a mystery and he goes back and forth between police, criminals, and other characters tangential to the plot. Note, when you're reading, pay attention to when you get lost or bored. That's even in good books that will happen, but figure out what loses you so you don't do that to your readers. Do you ever get lost in a good book? Sometimes. When is that? For me, if it's too description heavy, I will skim it or skip several pages because I don't have time for that. I want to get to the next plot point. But that may not be true for you. So figure out in your genre where you get bored, but also look in other genres so you have a sense of how it's the same and how it's different. Specific ways to improve your pacing. In Act 1, if this is slow, Act 1 needs to be fairly fast because you're trying to hook the reader into reading the rest of your story. So if it's slow, cut the exposition. Start in the normal world just before the inciting incident, right? When we are introduced in Star Wars, we're immediately have the bad guys taking over some sort of, I think that's Leia's ship, right? So start in the normal world just before the inciting incident so that inciting incident draws your reader into your story. Have a ticking clock. The movie Speed does that really, really well. It's a literal ticking clock. Cover more time. So if a novel covers 3 days, it's very detailed and slow paced. That seems backwards. But if you're only covering 3 days, you're giving more and more specific details about what happens. But if a novel covers 3 months, you have to cut to the most important or active scenes, and therefore it's faster paced because you're cutting out the boring stuff essentially. So think about that. The more time you're covering, the more concise and active your scenes are, which makes it faster paced. Whereas a novel that goes over 3 days shows more detail and the pacing would be slower. Decrease pacing. This is for those of you who go from action to action to action to action. One thing you can do is add more dialogue because that will naturally slow things down, cover less time. So in other words, instead of trying to just cover 24 hours, extend it a little bit so you can cut your scenes to just the most active portions of it. And then in a scene, one way to decrease the pacing, so say you've just had a major active scene and the reader needs a place to catch their breath before they're attacked by the bad guys again, or whatever your plot point is. With Myra, it could be, she's got some shapeshifter hunters after her, but she needs a minute to catch her breath. Your reader needs a moment to catch the breath. So add specific detail. In the same way we did with the emotional scene, you're also going to do that here in this scene to slow things down. So the hum of a heater turning on, the smell of stale air emanating from it, a leaf rattling in a car vent, all of these specific concrete details slow down the pacing so your reader and your character get a chance to breathe. Okay, so this is what we're going to work on today. What I want you to do is consider a turning point scene. You can use the class character or a character that you're developing for another project. This should be a tense scene where the character experiences a change, so a turning point. So where the character goes from, oh, I didn't know I was a shapeshifter, to, oh, and people are trying to kill me because I'm a shapeshifter, right? I want you to write the turning point, a moment of time, like one paragraph on this moment of time that's the turning point for this character. And the first time you write it, describe the scene using long, complex sentences. And then we'll do the same exact thing, but you're going to describe the scene using short clip sentences so that you can compare the difference. You have a natural writing style that's probably more one or the other, and I want you to go outside your comfort zone and try it first one way and then the other way and see how it impacts the pacing of your particular scene. Good luck.